welcoming everyone who has already signed on. For those of you who are not familiar with me or the center, my name is Amy Krupel, and I'm the director of the UF, University of Florida, Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and is part of the Jean Monnet in the US network. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's discussion will be recorded and will eventually be available on the UFCES website. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, and participants are encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. And this will ensure that we get your questions and understand them and don't miss them through a chat window or anything else. We want to thank everyone today for joining us for a UFCES EU briefing, Orban and Merkel's European People's Party, the end of the affair. This talk is supported by the Erasmus Jean Monnet Programme and the UF Jean Monnet Chair. The EU briefing series provides expert analysis on current news and events in the EU. And to learn more about this series and other CES events, please visit our website at ces.ufl.edu. We're very, very happy to welcome our speaker today. Many of you will be familiar with his work. Dr. R. Daniel Kelemen is Professor of Political Science and Law, as well as a Jean Monnet Chair at Rutgers University. In addition, Dr. Kelemen is a lecturer in law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. His research focuses on the politics of European Union law and politics, comparative political economy, and comparative public policy. His 2001 book, Eurolegalism, The Transformation of Law and Regulation in the EU, won the Best Book Award from the European Union Studies Association. And he's also the author or editor of 5 other books, as well as over 100 articles and book chapters, which is quite a daunting accomplishment. Dr. Kelemen comments regularly on EU affairs for European and American media. He has extensive experience consulting on EU affairs for political risk analysis firms and policymakers. And some of you may have seen that we have linked his recent Monkey blog piece on this topic on our various advertising sites. I don't want to take up any more time as you are all here to hear Dr. Kelemen talk. I would like to remind you all that when you leave the event, you will be sent immediately to a survey for this event. And we very much hope that you will take the time to answer our questions to help us provide better service and better talks and opportunities for everyone in the future. And with that, I hand the mic over to Dr. Kelemen.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be with Professor Krupel, one of my oldest friends in the business, so to speak, and had a terrific visit there. I can't remember how long ago it was because time has ceased to have meaning in the pandemic, but it was about 2 years ago or something, to University of Florida and your amazing Center for European Studies there. So it's nice to now join you virtually. And yeah, so we're here to talk about the breakup, the big breakup between the EPP and Fidesz. And as Professor Krupel mentioned, some of my thoughts on this issue are summarized in the Monkey Cage blog in an article this week. So I guess you all have a link to that. But let me I'm going to do the good old share screen trick here and show you some slides. All right. So can Amy, or can one of you just confirm, does this look good? Everyone seeing these slides?
Everybody should be able to see them just fine.
Okay. So let's talk about the end of the affair then. It was a long marriage. It's now a hasty divorce. And I want to start with some background and then bring us up to speed with last week's and this week's events. So, first, let's just remember the EU is supposed to be a union of liberal democracies. It's right there in the treaties. Member states are required to respect democracy and other fundamental values such as rule of law, human rights, etc. And yet, we have this situation. This is actually from yesterday. VDEM put out its new report. And we see right there, this is the top 10 autocratizing countries in the past decade. In other words, those that have had the steepest declines. And we see Poland leading the pack. They're still in the category of what's called electoral democracy, but they've had a very rapid decline. Hungary has already moved down to the category of electoral autocracy. So right there, and same for Freedom House and their categorization, we have an EU member state no longer categorized as a democracy. The story is well known. I'm not going to repeat it here. We can talk in Q&A, what Orban has done over the past decade. But in essence, he's maintained the facade of democracy with elections that are, essentially free. However, he, through capturing the judiciary, seizing control of the media, undermining opposition parties with his control of the election regulator, et cetera, he has so substantially rigged the game in his favor that it makes it nearly impossible, if not totally impossible, but nearly, for the opposition to win. And this is what political scientists call an electoral autocracy. So then that brings us to our puzzle in this EPP story. Why is it that the EU, which professes these commitments, has allowed this to happen and has allowed member states, such as at least one member state, to become a competitive authoritarian regime? Well, I've worked on this. Probably the biggest recent article was last year in the Journal of European Public Policy, called The EU's Authoritarian Equilibrium. And I'm not going to talk about that whole argument. I just want to focus on one piece, which relates to today's story about the European People's Party. And the basic argument I make in this work and in related articles is that autocracies can survive in a multi-level polity like the EU for the same reason they survive in other multi-level polities. There's a set of dynamics involving party politics, funding from the center, and emigration. In fact, in the EU, these problems are even worse. But today we're going to focus on this first one, party politics, and how that helps a regime like Orban's survive. Okay, and the lessons here come from literature on comparative federalism. The US, it's a very familiar story. Well, this is University of Florida, so it's in your own history there, that we had one-party autocratic regimes in the US South for nearly a century after the Civil War, the one party being the Democratic Party. And the reason they were able to disenfranchise African-American citizens and run these single-party states is because they had political protection from the National Democratic Party. They provided votes for Democrats in Congress, helped Democrats elect presidents. In exchange, Democrats protected their party states in the South from any federal censure. Well, guess what? Same thing in the EU. Similar dynamics involving, in the EU case, what are known as Euro parties, right? So Euro parties like the EPP, ALDE, which in the parliament is now known as the Renew Group, the Socialists and Democrats, the Greens, the European Conservatives and Reformists. These are key players in EU politics. And by the way, Professor Coppell has done some very important research on Euro parties in the European Parliament as well. So, and I'd say, these Euro parties over time have become more powerful and more important. So, over time, there's been a shift from representatives voting more on national lines to voting more on these Euro party lines. The whole attempt to create this Spitzenkandidat process, which kind of fell apart this year. We could talk about that, but still, this sort of drive to link the Commission presidency to dominance in the European Parliament, that's only raised the stakes for Euro parties and for having the biggest Euro party, right? So if you have the biggest Euro party in the European Parliament, or the biggest parliamentary group in the European Parliament, then you get to have the Commission presidency as well. But Euro parties aren't only important in the Parliament, they're also important in the Council, where they coordinate policy among member governments. And so, one thought is that there's this perverse consequence of trying to democratize the EU. Everyone talks about the democratic deficit. They usually have in mind deficits at the EU level. But by trying to make the EU more democratic, by having partisan competition at the EU level, making the Commission presidency more political and tied to those elections, et cetera, well, then you've heightened incentives for Euro parties to be as big as possible, even if that means tolerating autocratic member parties, okay? And so this kind of effort to democratize the EU level has helped make the EU a haven for national autocracies, okay? And why then has the EU failed to intervene in Hungary over the past decade more robustly? Well, the number one answer, there's of course other factors, I talk about those in my work, but the number one factor has been the EPP, because Orban has throughout this period until, well, last week he left the EPP group, He's looking likely to leave the EPP party as a whole. We'll get to that. But until now, he's been a member of the EPP. And the EPP isn't just any Euro party. It's the most powerful Euro party in EU level politics, the dominant force, both in the past 3 Commission presidents have been EPP. The EPP is the biggest bloc in the European Parliament. The EPP usually holds pluralities in the College of Commissioners, so it's the dominant force. And of course, its biggest, most powerful member party is the CDU or the CDU-CSU kind of combination there. So we see some of Orban's big protectors. So, in essence, it's just like what I said about the US and that, trade-off with the Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Fidesz delivers seats in the European Parliament that help the EPP to be the biggest group, help it elect Commission presidents, et cetera. And in exchange, it gets political protection from the EPP and sheltering from any EU censure. So, who have been the key defenders of autocracy in the EU? There they are, all these EPP leaders, right, who are supposedly the democratic center-right, and Commission presidents. Now, Juncker, you may remember some incident when he jokingly called Orban the dictator, but again, that was a joke. He kind of slapped him, hey, dictator. Actually, he talked about Orban as his good friend, et cetera, and, consistently was a defender. Then in the European Parliament, the most shameless Orban enabler was Manfred Weber, who he's now trying to kind of sanitize his record. But he actually, endorsed Orban's election campaign up until 2018, right? In elections which the OSCE, said were deeply unfair because of the government abusing its power to favor the ruling party. But nevertheless, Orban was supported by Weber. Yeah, and then when Weber was running for Commission presidency as the Spitzenkandidat of the EPP, he was drawing on support of Orban, or he hoped he could, until the relationship broke down toward the end, which we can get to. But of course, the most powerful enabler, I just want to pause on this for a second because it's really been lost in a lot of the coverage, is, Angela Merkel is known to a lot of people as the leader of the free world, right? And the paragon of liberal democracy. And in a lot of ways she is, and I have deep respect for her and so much of what she's done. But on this issue, let's be clear. Merkel has been the biggest defender of Orban, the most powerful in the past decade, enabling him to consolidate his electoral autocracy. I would encourage anyone to try to scour the record to find any negative word Angela Merkel has ever said about Viktor Orban, because I haven't found any. Okay. And she then we come to the Commission president now. Although Weber's candidacy was derailed, and we can talk about why, it's a bigger story. In part, the fact that he had such close ties to Orban, I think, hurt him with some key players. But there were other factors behind why Weber's candidacy was derailed. But then, as we know, Macron then came up with this kind of compromise candidate. We said, okay, it can still be an EPP person, but let's not have this Weber character. Let's have the German defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen. But interestingly, von der Leyen, to get elected president, needed Orban's votes. She also needed Kaczynski's votes he's in a different group, the ECR. And so, there was a little quid pro quo. She got Orban's support to become president. She gave him the commissioner for enlargement so he could influence EU enlargement policy. And more generally, I think that emphasizes one of the other dangers with these Euro parties and their pet autocrats. The pet autocrats don't just do bad things back at home, like in Hungary. They also actively try to infiltrate EU institutions, which, by the way, we also saw historically in the US, where Southern Democrats got control of key committees in Congress, et cetera. So, we have EPP and Fidesz and the Fidesz junior partner called the KDNP, politicians affiliated with them getting vice chairmanships and things like that in the European Parliament. I just mentioned in the Commission enlargement. Let me pause to just mention one other thing. You may have seen in the news last year when this Fidesz MEP was caught leaving a drug-fueled orgy, which also violated the lockdown rules in Belgium. And then as a result of that, he resigned, et cetera. I just want to mention that MEP had been like the equivalent of what we would call the party whip of the EPP until just the year before, right? So, they're not just bit players, they're key players. Okay, and they also, of course, keep the funds flowing to these regimes. I'm going to skip that. I would emphasize, to be fair here, it's not just the EPP, although they are the worst offender, to be sure. Other Euro parties also have their pet autocrats. This picture shows you the different groups, right? So the ECR group, that used to be the home to the Tories before they left the EU. They have Poland's Kaczynski, who's the second most advanced country down the road to autocracy, right? They're supported by the ECR. The socialists had the Romanian Socialist Party, that character Dragnea. He's in jail now, but he was a kind of kleptocrat in Romania, and he had a lot of support from the PES at the EU level. Even the supposedly very virtuous liberals of ALDE, they have Czech President Andrej Babiš and his ANO party are members, right? So that's a kind of odd bedfellows for someone like Guy Verhofstadt. So this stuff is all over the place, okay? And the last thing I want to say before we kind of move to the present is the Euro parties, and part of why it's in this kind of equilibrium, this autocracy trap, is there's something very poisonous about being a half-baked Euro party, because Euro parties, they're not real political parties, right? They're kind of coalitions of national parties. I say they're not real because few voters know they exist. When you go to vote in European Parliament elections, for instance, you see your national party on the ballot that you're voting for, like you see CDU. You don't even see EPP normally on national ballots, right? And so, voters don't know they exist. They don't know who the member parties are. So most German voters, for instance, would have never known that Merkel was allies with Orban. And so that creates this perverse set of incentives where you have all the incentive to have a pet autocrat in your Euro party because of all the things we've said already. But there's no downside because it doesn't damage your party brand with voters, or at least it hasn't until now, because voters don't even know about it. So, that brings us to a point we'll get to, which is as awareness of these alliances increases, I think that could have an impact. All right, so now let's talk about the divorce, and I'll make this quick. What's our path to divorce? I'm just going to skip a couple of things. Well, look, there's been talk for a while. There's, in 2018, Merkel, again, without criticizing Orban directly, was kind of making it clear that the EPP had certain red lines. They've talked about this idea of red lines that Fidesz shouldn't cross. Actually, since 2017 was the first time. But Fidesz crossed all the red lines with impunity on things like kicking out the CEU, on their laws and the treatment of NGOs, et cetera, and on kind of corruption issues. So they crossed all the red lines and there was no censure. Finally, the beginnings of a rupture came in 2019 when Orban, in the kind of run up to the European Parliament elections, started this mass campaign across the country, basically vilifying the Commission President Juncker, suggesting in a kind of very anti-Semitic overtones that he was in a conspiracy with George Soros to flood Hungary with refugees. Okay, and this was like a direct attack, on the EPP leadership, and that finally was the final straw for some member parties. So the Swedes were the first movers, and they kicked off a kind of wave where 14 member parties of the EPP called for kicking Fidesz out of the party, okay? And so for a while, it looked like something might happen. But then Manfred Weber intervened to prevent this, and the CDU more generally. They didn't want Fidesz kicked out. Weber didn't want Fidesz leaving before the election because he wanted those votes, for him, he was hoping, for presidency. So they came up with this compromise, which was a fake suspension. They said, we're suspending Fidesz. And a lot of people in the press bought it. Oh, wow, Hungary, Orban's been suspended from the EPP. But it was, and they said they're suspended pending the outcome of an inquiry by, they formed a committee of wise men, they said. Okay, so let's look at the truth of what happened. Number one, the committee of wise men never issued a report, never concluded their study. Number two, the suspension was basically meaningless in that it did not apply to the EPP group in the European Parliament. Therefore, the Fidesz members remained members in perfectly good standing in the EPP group, and EPP still got to benefit from their votes, and EPP still got support for von der Leyen as president, right? All that the so-called suspension meant was that Orban couldn't come to like general meetings of the EPP leaders. So that maybe avoided uncomfortable photo ops with these heads of government with Orban. But otherwise, it was basically a symbolic, meaningless move, and the relationship continued until last week. So what were the final straws? Well, and I'm almost done. I'll be done in 2 minutes, so we can go to Q&A. In the fight over the budget in November and December of last year, where there was the move to conclude the multi-annual financial framework and also the related recovery package, and we had trillions on the line, huge amounts of money. There was a call based on a proposal the Commission had made already a couple of years before to introduce this idea of rule of law conditionality. And that was a proposal for a new regulation that would create a kind of new mechanism whereby the Commission could suspend EU funding from the budget to member states who violated rule of law norms in a serious and systematic way. Okay, we can talk more about that regulation if you want in the Q&A. But anyway, this proposal was on the table, and there were negotiations going on about both about the budget and passing the budget, but also simultaneously passing this rule of law conditionality to go along with it. Well, in short, Fidesz was totally against rule of law conditionality because they knew that might mean that their gravy train, the huge floods of EU money that support the Orban regime and all the cronies could be cut off. And so they threatened to block the entire EU budget and the recovery fund. Now, the recovery fund was the pet project of Merkel and was going to be one of her key legacies as she heads out the door. So the CDU is not happy about this, of course. That created tensions. And then in the fight over this in the European Parliament, the leader of the Fidesz faction in the European Parliament, this guy named Thomas Deutsch, he compared Manfred Weber to a Gestapo guard, basically. And that then led to a new call. They said, well, that's too much. So again, we see a pattern where you can build an autocracy, you can kick out universities, you can trample academic freedom, you can take over the media. The EPP would be okay with that, but they were not okay when you start directly insulting their leaders. Anyway, so this triggered this latest call for revisiting this expulsion question. Then they were stalling a bit because of COVID and saying they couldn't meet in person, et cetera. But then the final move, what happened last week, and I'll admit it took me by surprise that they finally pushed for this vote last week. It happened more quickly than I thought, but they basically took a vote in the EPP group to change their rules of procedure, because before, just to be clear, in the rules of procedure of the EPP group, there was a mechanism for expelling or excluding, as they call it, individual MEPs for behavior they found unacceptable. So they excluded this guy Deutsch, right? Or mostly. Actually, they didn't even quite exclude him, if I'm honest, but they kind of targeted a punishment at him. But they said, actually, we should be able to exclude an entire delegation or entire group of MEPs from a country. And so they changed the rules of procedure in a way that would allow them to expel a group en masse. And then that was a signal. Orban knew that was targeted at Fidesz. And rather than be pushed out and risk the humiliation of a vote to expel his party from the group, he then announced, okay, I'm just leaving the party. So he jumped before he could push. Or as you might say, you can't fire me, I quit. Okay, now, where are we now? So Orban issued a very incendiary statement the day after he quit, saying that he's now looking to form a new vast right-wing bloc, saying the EPP, they're really just lefties now, and I am the true right in Europe. And he's in talks with Liga and Salvini, and Kaczynski in Poland, and saying he wants to form a new group. Meanwhile, the ECR has invited him to join its grouping. For now, the Fidesz MEPs, are independent or unaffiliated, as they call it. So what do I think is going to happen? Well, Orban has dreamed about forming a new, or not maybe dreamed, but he's threatened or talked about, this idea of forming a new right-wing grouping before. That was, of course, always the big fear of the EPP. Wasn't just that they would lose Orban's votes, but that he would help take other parties out of the EPP and form this new coalition further to the right. I don't think he'll succeed in that. There are reasons it's failed before. It's hard to unite all of the far right in Europe. That being said, I think the most likely outcome is he will join the ECR, where Kaczynski's PIS party of Poland is. That's the key player in helping defend Orban. Because keep in mind, now that he's lost his previous defender, he needs a new political home and others to help defend him against EU censure. The strongest potential defender is ECR. Now, might they pull another party or two from the EPP? Maybe. Maybe they'll bring Slovenia's Janša and his party. That's possible. But I don't think they'll bring many from the EPP. Will they bring in anyone from the identity group in the parliament? Maybe. There's been talk that Liga might move over. They'd have to kick out the Fratelli d'Italia, I think, and in order for Liga to join. But that's possible that they would have some shakeup on the far right. But I don't think they'll become a huge, overwhelming force, under the umbrella of Orban or anything like that. So I think that's where we're headed, maybe a bit of a shakeup. But I do think, while this won't change things overnight, it's not like we will suddenly see a huge EU crackdown on Hungary overnight because of this. It definitely opens the door, because the EPP was so crucial in protecting Orban, right? He's now lost that protection, and that opens the door for the Commission to take a tougher stand. Yes, Poland will try to protect him, but they can't provide the degree of political protection that the EPP did. So it's a good development for the EU, long overdue. The EPP, in particular, the CDU, really shamed itself with its appeasement for a decade, but at least they've finally done the right thing. All right, so I'll stop there and Q&A.
Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat window, which I will go ahead and ask you, but I would encourage folks to use the Q&A format. It's just a little easier for us to manage and to follow. Alexander Faludi asked or noted that Jobbik has tried hard to rebrand itself as a moderate party with aspirations to join the EPP, and hence has created a tagline for the Hungarian People's Party. Do you think these aspirations are at all realistic? And I would add, and if so, is that a potential new problem?
Yeah, I don't think that's realistic. The EPP, for all its appeasement and shameful behavior, I'd say they did have a kind of one red line, which is they didn't, you could be far right, you could be authoritarian, but you couldn't have like any kind of direct lineage from, or generally speaking, with kind of Nazi parties or, directly with fascism, right? And so that's why they would never touch Le Pen, for instance, right? Even if she becomes more moderate, they just wouldn't touch that. And I think similarly, Jobbik basically in policy substance and most things has probably moved to the left of Fidesz by now, but they have these roots in kind of, associations with neo-fascism. So I doubt that'll work. That being said, on his question, I think what is important is this, that for now, EPP has no member party in Hungary, right? Well, they have this little thing called the KDNP, this Christian Democrats. That's basically a bogus tiny party that's an affiliate of Fidesz, okay? But let's leave that aside because that's not a serious party. My point is, EPP will want to cultivate eventually a strong member party in Hungary, right? So in a sense, I see this as an opportunity. If democracy is going to be restored in Hungary, maybe some faction from Fidesz or just people on the center right, will try to form a new party that with aspirations to become the kind of, new EPP member. But I don't think that can be Jobbik. Okay,
thank you. We have another question from Martino Comelli. I'm going to shorten it just a bit. He's skeptical of the idea that Orban and Fidesz was tolerated just because of seats in the EP, and instead argues that you may underplay how close Orban was and is to other EPP parties, particularly looking at other members such as Forza Italia, who of course had racist policies on immigration, the cultural debate in Germany with Merkel and Sarkozy's Chador debate, etc. And he asks or argues that the EPP is authoritarian liberalism and identity politics, which is also Orban's position. And do you think, the question, that this divorce will actually change anything in those dynamics in the East or the West? Or does it actually simply provide more space to apply these same policies, but with an added veil of respectability potentially on both sides?
Okay, here's what I'd say on that. The EPP has been a big tent party, okay? And that's been its aspiration, to be as big as possible, to dominate the center right, right? And I don't think it's fair to say that the EPP is kind of authoritarian liberalism, or whatever the term was, neoliberalism. It's fair to say some of its member parties might, fit that, but there's also very moderate and parties, let's say in particular, like the Scandinavian EPP members, who are principled Democrats and moderates and centrists. So the thing is that the EPP was trying to maintain this very broad alliance that had ideologically very distinct parties. Now, I think it's true that for some of the EPP parties who are quite on the right, Fidesz membership was in part attractive because of the ideological affinity. Maybe not for the for the authoritarian or the autocratic practices per se, but definitely for the harsh policies on refugees and migrants and the kind of far right rhetoric. People talk a lot these days about the idea of virtue signaling. Well, someone I can't remember who coined this term, but I've heard the term somewhere, which seems apropos here, of vice signaling instead of virtue signaling. And I think for some of these parties, I don't know, take like CSU in Bavaria, at least under their previous leadership, which was quite right. Yeah, they like being in the same party with Orban doing photo ops, because it's like, I might not be able to quite do or say the things he does, but I'm sending a signal like, this guy's my friend, right? So that tells you what you need to know about where I stand on certain things. So but yeah, I think the fear was really always that if they would boot Orban, so this is where I'm agreeing with the questioner, it was never just about the votes in the European Parliament. And if that was the impression I gave, that's not what I meant to say. It's more broadly about being the biggest and most dominant force throughout at the EU level, across institutions, right? And to do that, to maintain, being a big tent. Yeah.
Okay, we do have a number of other questions. I was trying to see if I could merge some of them. We have some questions specific to the role of Hungary. Emir Bartosz asks, could you comment on any role Hungary's Eastern opening may have played in the developments that you discussed? So domestic politics or foreign policy, but non-EU.
So Orban is basically the Trojan horse for Putin within the EU, or one of them. He's at least the best positioned. The Putin regime has cultivated, tries to undermine the EU every way it can, from Brexit support to support for far-right parties like Le Pen's party, to cultivating ties with friendly regimes like Orban's, right? And doing energy deals with them, et cetera. Now, does that worry some in the EU and, by the way, in NATO? Sure it does, right? Because Orban, in different foreign policy issues, has in some cases wielded vetoes on issues that in ways that kind of supported Moscow's policies. Was that decisive on this expulsion? I don't think so. I think this came down more to I talked to you about like the insults of the leaders and the way the fight broke out, but there are other issues. If we look at why the rupture happened now, again, the key turning point, there were already a lot of parties who were pushing for Orban's expulsion, right? Within the EPP, there were more than a dozen, right? But the key was that the CDU stuck with him until now, right? And CSU. So why did they turn? I can't get inside Merkel's head or all the EPP leaders, or sorry, the CDU leaders' heads. But I think one thing is there's a changing of the guard coming. Merkel's leaving, new leadership's coming in. It's looking like, for instance, in the upcoming German, elections and the government that will follow, there's a good chance the CDU might have to govern with the Greens. Well, the Greens aren't going to be keen on CDU having a partnership, with Orban, right? They're actually very principled on these issues. So I think there were other things domestically that may have been, pushing for the divorce, but I don't think it was the Russia policy per se that did it.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple of questions that look at sort of broader impacts. We have Spencer Core, who's an EU studies student here at UF, who notes that he's seen a plethora of pessimistic outlooks for the future of the EU recently as a result of the rise of populism, and some political scientists claiming that this is yet another meaningless gesture that has come too little too late. Are you more optimistic about this? Is this false hope or likely a turning point? And I would just connect this with Asla Baisal's question, who's wondering how much of what's happened with the ability for Fidesz in Hungary to go down this non-democratic path is a result of the inefficacy of Article 7 versus the lack of expulsion.
Okay, so let me start with the last part and come back. So yeah, Article 7 is a dead letter because to actually apply any of the sanctions foreseen under Article 7, you'll ultimately need unanimity. And they're not going to get unanimity, right? Partly that's because of Poland, but it's not only Poland. There's others, like Slovenia wouldn't vote for it either. I mean, I think it's a rule of thumb in EU politics, for anyone studying EU politics, anything the EU is serious about enforcing is not sent to the council to enforce it, right? The council will not, and certainly not unanimity. If you're requiring unanimity for enforcement, you're not serious. If you want to enforce things, you give it to the commission. So Article 7 isn't the answer, but Article 7 was never the only tool. There are a lot of other tools in the toolkit of the commission, from infringement procedures to the regulations of structural funds to now this, new rule of law conditionality mechanism where the commission you can take the lead role in sanctioning. And let me be clear, a key reason the commission did not sanction Orban more is because of the dominance of the EPP within the commission, right? So that is obvious. So that could change now. Now, I guess on the broader question from Spencer about, I guess that was sort of about, how should we see this, in the long run? Does this make us pessimistic for the EU?
Is it too little too late? Is it just a gesture, or do you expect more substantive change?
I don't think it's too little too late. Let's go back to US history for a second. There's a kind of lesson. I don't know if it should be encouraging or depressing, probably depressing, but I mean, this kind of idea of enclaves of authoritarianism at the state level, where you had autocratic states within what's a broadly democratic union, that lasted for nearly 100 years in the US, right? So on the one hand, if you apply that lesson, that's very worrying for the EU or Hungary, Poland, because it means, hey, this stuff can go on in these kind of unions for decades. I mean, same thing like in Argentina, they had autocratic states after they transitioned to democracy, some of which went on like that under a strongman, the caudillo ruler for like 30 years, right? So this stuff can last for a long time. Now that's terrible. That also means maybe on, Spencer's too little too late question, it depends on the time horizon you take. I think if you take the long view, right, you say, okay, this is at least a good development. This is in an emerging party system with these half-baked parties. This is maybe, one of the first time we're seeing a breakup where a party really says in a prominent way with a prominent autocratic ruler, you're basically, we're breaking up with you, it's time to part ways. So that to me is a hopeful sign that maybe voter awareness of these relationships will increase, and then pressure on parties to dump their pet autocrats may increase. At the same time, it means we shouldn't expect a solution maybe tomorrow.
Okay, and then we have a question from Emily Unruh, who's connecting, I think, the broader rise of the far right to maybe what's been happening in the US, including the January 6th attack, noting that this has similar red flags, Can you comment on the comparative politics aspect here and the similar effect this may have for democracy in both Europe and America?
Wait, okay. I kind of lost. Can you help me with that? Is that one
Yeah,
written down?
I think the notion is that what we're seeing is the rise of the far right, and we're seeing the rise of populist and anti-democratic actors. And in the
Okay.
EU, this has manifested as an illiberal regime. In Hungary, in the US, it has manifested as attacks on our central democratic institutions. So is the change that we're seeing in the response from the EPP, might that give us some indication? And I may be misinterpreting her question, but maybe we're going to see a similar response and a distancing within the GOP, for example.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, I wish that were true, but I doubt it. I think, the question hits, a key issue right on the head, which, research by people like Dan Ziblatt, Steve Levitsky, others, really emphasizes that a crucial thing for the erosion of democracy, maybe the crucial thing, or well, one of the crucial things, is how the center right reacts to the emergence of the far right, right? Does the center right, appease them? Does thinking, oh, we can't win without them, the classic mistake of the German, the German right with the rise of Hitler and that sort of thing is, that attempts to appease them, turn out not to work, et cetera. So, this has always been a dilemma or a question for the center right. What do we do, with the rise of potentially anti-democratic forces to our right? So I think that, that's key. So, on the one hand, yeah, this is encouraging that, there's this breakup, right? Do I think that portends, a breakup in the US between anti-democratic forces of Trumpism and the GOP? I don't see any sign of that, unfortunately. I wish, but it seems like, the remaining voices of like sane, centrism, Mitt Romney and that, they're a small minority now within the party. So I'm afraid it's a little late for the GOP. Yeah, and I guess the one other thing I'd like to say, though, I do think it's important to make this distinction that when it comes to Orban, I mean, believe me, I'm disgusted by all the far right aspect of him and his ideology, anti-LGBT, anti-minority, everything, right? He's Islamophobic. But, from the EU, and many of those things maybe, lead to policies which are illegal under EU law. But when we talk about him being an autocrat, it's not because he has far right ideology. In fact, he uses the far right ideology to distract us from his capture of the judiciary, the media, et cetera. The main thing he wants to do is have single party rule and steal money, right? For, or enrich his cronies. And, the like talking about refugees and all that far right rhetoric, that is just a distraction while he pockets money from Brussels.
Okay, well, that's cheerful. We have two questions that link current events to the pandemic more broadly. Mark Kopolovich and Sarah Goodman. Mark asks two questions. Would love to hear your thoughts on what the EPP and Orban development means for the ERC and the future of EU-level fiscal policy responses to COVID. And what, if anything, might German elections and a new chancellor mean for how the CDU treats Orban and authoritarians? And really how much of what we saw in the past was Merkel versus the CDU-CSU. So that's kind of a separate question. And then Sarah Goodman also asks or notes that the COVID-19 pandemic has allowed for the buildup of authoritarian power in some of the states you discuss, but also in a decline of support for the far right parties, for example, in the Netherlands. Do you see anything about the long-term effects of the pandemic on support for liberal democracy and variations within the EU? So really the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the interaction between that and parties of the anti-democratic parties.
Okay, these are great questions. Let me start, I'll start with Mark's, who's first there. What do these developments mean for the ERC? That's European Recovery Facility thing, right? That's what, I assume that's what Mark means, like the recovery fund. I forget, there's so many acronyms, even I forget, but I think that he's talking about the recovery package. And okay, and then he has a question about, the future German governments. I mean, one thing to say on the funding, I don't even know what the date will be. I haven't seen the date, but individual member governments still have to vote to approve, basically pass through their portion of the application of the recovery fund. So we're still waiting for that from Hungary. Only a few countries have done it so far, right? So there's still question marks of whether Orban could try to block anything, but I don't think so. I mean, basically, that whole thing where Orban was threatening to block the recovery fund in the budget, I always thought that was a huge bluff. I wrote about it at the time. I think I had some piece in Politico. I said, they're bluffing, because they depend on the money. They get about, in Hungary, 3.5% of GDP every year handed to them, right? Of which Fidesz then can skim off a portion, right, by the EU. And so, they desperately need the money. And so I don't think they're going to, stand in the way of that. And then, on the second question from Mark, that was about, what we might expect from a new CDU chancellor. Well, there were worrying signs. One of the lead candidates is, of course, the new leader of the CDU, Laschet, right? Armin Laschet. And he basically, in the first interviews he gave, revealed himself to be a complete Orban appeaser in the kind of Merkel and von der Leyen mode, right? Saying, oh, we can't be too tough lest they flee into the arms of Russia or some nonsense like that, right? And basically we need to have dialogue. So Laschet was worrying. Now, one of the other candidates, interestingly, who you would think would be more on the right, which is Söder from the CSU in Bavaria, he was one who came out a couple of days ago and said, enough is enough. We need the Fidesz to leave the entire EPP party now. So it seems like Söder, who's, I think has got a very good chance to be the next chancellor, actually, is trying to position himself as an anti-Orban candidate. So again, that's encouraging. And I think once they aren't so tied to Orban, that will at least open the way for a tougher stance on autocrats. Whether they seize that opportunity, we'll have to see. On Sarah's question, on COVID and the response, and how that's sort of, there's this irony. It's opened a path for using the emergency as an excuse for autocrats to kind of seize more power, but then Sarah would know more than me. I haven't looked at all the polling. He says it's led to a decline in support for some of the far right parties. Okay, what's the long-term impact of the pandemic? First, I just want to give a plug. There's a great collection in this website called Verfassungsblog that was organized by academic law scholar Joelle Grogan from Middlesex University in London. And she put together an incredible collection looking at how different regimes have kind of used and abused the pandemic for erosion of rule of law and democratic values. So I think that's a key place to look. Certainly leaders like Orban, he's declared emergency powers during the pandemic and used that to suspend prerogatives of parliament and increase rule by decree, things like that. I think there's a scope, for abuse there. I don't know. I can't say. I don't have a good answer, Sarah, on long-term, whether this will, lead to more support for liberal democracy. I'd like to hope it leads to support for kind of competence. And I do think since some of the autocratic regimes, actually, when it comes down to it, are not very good at these things. Like if we look at Orban specifically, on the one hand, he's rushing to try to show he can be an effective responder. He's buying the Russian vaccine, the Chinese vaccine. But on the other hand, the pandemic is revealing the decrepit state of healthcare in the country, in part because his regime isn't investing in that and instead doing pet projects of cronies. But I don't know. I haven't researched it enough, Sarah, to have a really deep, wise answer for that. But I have a feeling you might be someone who'll be looking into that for us.
All right. Gosh, I'm trying to keep up with the questions. Kind of linked to Mark's question about elections in Germany. Gina Boni reflects that next spring there will be parliamentary elections in Hungary, or it looks like there will be. What do you think the Hungarian opposition's chances are, despite the fact that you've said it's already somewhat unlikely that they will not win? I guess, do you want to double down on that?
Okay, I mean, let's be clear, and this is, clear from the literature on competitive autocracies and competitive authoritarian regimes. It's not true that the opposition can never win, right? In fact, elections in these competitive autocracies, they're key moments for the regime because, on the one hand, they're crucial to maintaining like the claim of legitimacy, like, look, see, we have elections. On the other hand, they can be rallying points and moments where if everything goes right, all the cards fall into place. It's not impossible the opposition can win, right? But the point is the playing field is not level, right? The government uses its control of all the independent institutions from the previously independent, what should be independent institutions, things like the election regulator, the media regulator, the what did I leave out? The courts, right? To tilt the playing field in its favor. Now, so Orban has done that quite successfully. And what am I talking about? They do things like in the run up to elections, they issue massive fines against opposition parties, right? On trumped up charges, with, of course, a Fidesz guy in charge of the election regulator, things like that. So what's happened this time, and then also I should add, they changed the electoral rules in the country in ways designated to benefit the Fidesz party, okay, without going into all the details. The opposition in Hungary has responded to that finally in a way that they never had succeeded before. They have committed to all unite, like all the opposition parties from left all the way to including Jobbik, which is of course quite controversial, to make a coalition to try to oust Fidesz. So this is, maybe if there's ever a moment they could hope to oust him, this might be it in the next elections. That being said, and with problems with the COVID response, et cetera, maybe there'll be more people rallying to their support. That being said, I find it very hard at this point to believe he would let himself lose. So I expect lots of shenanigans up to and including mass fraud in the election, just to rig it. And keep in mind, there's one of the ironies, like the EU doesn't regulate elections in member states, right? They just trust that they're democratic. The OSCE will send a little mission of a few people. They already declared the last two elections unfair, but it's a real issue. Like there's no Voting Rights Act in the EU, right? And if there is a lot of fraud and cheating, both subtle and less subtle forms, there's not a lot the EU can do about it. And of course, even if it's obvious to lots of states, Kaczynski and others would still veto Article 7, right?
Okay, we have just a little bit of time left. We have two questions that are a little bit interrelated in terms of likely party response. Andy Sherry asks, relatedly, is there a chance that the expulsion or the voluntary leaving before expulsion of Fidesz will promote a more robust cooperation between EU states that is led by non-EPP parties, for example, the Greens and the Social Dems everywhere but Germany? And then a different party question from Alexander Faludi is, can Orban lure other East European EPP party members to follow him out, or maybe more advantageously use the prospect of doing so as a lever within the EPP or negotiations with the EPP in the future? So.
Well, yeah, that's always been his lever. Again, it wasn't just Orban and his votes they were worried about. They were worried about that others who are more like-minded on the right side of the spectrum, kleptocrats, autocrats, that they would follow him out. As I said, I think it's possible he might see one other party or two join him in leaving, the most likely being Janša from Slovenia, maybe Gerb from Bulgaria, but I doubt it. But yeah, I don't think we'll see any kind of mass exodus or big rupture within EPP, but maybe one party or so leaves. I mean, in more generally on the other question from Andy Sherry about how this would affect kind of coalition dynamics, that sort of thing. I don't see it. Maybe I'm missing the logic. Like I haven't thought it through enough, about how this would really facilitate coalitions of other non-EPP parties that he's getting at. I think what it does is, like I was referring to, it maybe makes it easier for EPP to maintain or explore coalitions with parties like the Greens, who would, found the membership of Fidesz and EPP very distasteful. That being said, I would remind everyone of one little thing that hardly anyone noticed. But when Macron was in the run-up to the European Parliament elections, Macron's MEPs, or the people who were gonna, kind of from his party who were campaigning, they had said, well, we don't want to be part of any coalition to support like a commission president and it kind of have a governing coalition within the European Parliament with EPP if Fidesz is still in, right? There was a guy, what was his name? Pascal Canfin, who's one of the leading figures in the Renew group from France, but they forgot about all that after the elections, right? And they kind of still joined in this coalition despite Fidesz being there.
All right, I think we have officially about 2 minutes left. We have a couple of questions. An interesting one from an anonymous attendee. Any ideas how the democratic backsliding and half-baked party system might be reflected upon in the Conference on the Future of Europe? Can the cases of Hungary and Poland trigger some effective self-reflection on the EU's political system?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit of a skeptic about that conference. I haven't said anything about it publicly, partly because I know a lot of good people are backing it and have hope for it. And I don't want to rain on the parade by saying, being pessimistic. But if I'm honest, I kind of don't, I think the EU doesn't really need another conference on the future or future conferences on the future of conferences. I don't know, it's just too much navel gazing, I think. So I'm a little skeptical. That being said, I mean, since they're having this thing, I do think it's crucial that a big item on the agenda in the conference is to, look at these questions of democratic backsliding within the EU, the weakness of responses from EU institutions, and the need for stronger enforcement by the Commission and others. And I think in particular, I think this question of kind of voting rights is a big area I think needs to be explored for the future of kind of European democracy. Like I said, there's no EU Voting Rights Act. I mean, you have this bizarre phenomena where, Orban plays this trick, and it's not just him, where basically if you're a European citizen and you emigrate to another member state, yeah, you can vote in European Parliament elections and local elections, but you can't vote in national elections, right? But your home government, where you are allowed to vote, they can make it very hard for you to vote back home, right? By making you show up at a consulate, right? And that sort of thing, of which there are few places. So why is that important? Because what it means is effectively, if you look at the hundreds of thousands of Hungarians who've moved away and gone to other member states, right, to live and exercise their free movement, 90% of them don't vote in national elections back home because it's so hard to do so. So that means that, free movement is basically disenfranchising people, right? And that's not good, right? So I think the EU needs to do something more on kind of voting rights, particularly for mobile European citizens, to make sure that every European citizen really has the full franchise under fair conditions.
Okay, a lot of people have had to go. We are officially over time. There is another question asking you more broadly about your thoughts on Orban's broader efforts to have an influence and potentially shape not only politics, but also perhaps the study of Hungary and the understanding of his regime, particularly. I mean, obviously there's the case of the CEU, but also potentially through funding by the Magyar Foundation for institutions in the United States and elsewhere. Do you see that as an effective strategy, or something that is potentially another risk to democracy in Hungary or elsewhere?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, on education, it's gone, CEU is the kind of most famous case because of its, prominence and ties to, the US, et cetera. But, and it's terrible that they were expelled and had to move most of their academic operations to Vienna. But really, the penetration of education goes, of course, far beyond that. Fidesz has taken over essentially all the universities in Hungary. That doesn't mean that academics are arrested or things like that. No, but it means that the leadership of the universities is pretty much in the hands of Fidesz loyalists, and that puts a chilling effect on academic freedom, right? And also on research. He's taken over the Academy of Sciences in a way to steer research the way he wants. He recently set up this new sort of system of public foundations, they call it, to screen money from public scrutiny and kind of transforming universities into this form of governance, again, to hide what happens in them. So it's very sad and it's depressing, what he's doing to education there. Will he, and yes, as the questioner said, he funds all these kind of propaganda operations in the US, lobbying and different bogus groups. Will that transform the perception and understanding? No, I mean, on the one hand, within Hungary, yeah, it's terrible. Even at the K through 12 level, they've rewritten textbooks in ways to kind of propagandize on behalf of the government. And so, of course, that can have an effect. But I think in the international narrative and coverage, there's enough voices out there, telling the truth of what's happening in the country that very few people are fooled. And these kind of initiatives don't have much resonance outside of, the circles of the loyalists and outside of maybe rural Hungary where, people who don't have access to a lot of other information may be swayed.
Okay. We have one final question, if you have the time.
Sure, I can take one more. Sure.
Apparently, it is the $6 million question. And this is Spencer coming back for seconds. The literature paints a clear picture that authoritarian regimes with diversified institutionalized power are quite difficult to constrain. What steps could the EU reasonably take to combat this backsliding? And he notes that this is a $1 million question, but it seems that all of the EU's options are not pragmatically or politically feasible.
Okay, hold on a second. Give me 2 seconds. Here, I'm pasting something for Spencer.
Okay.
Where I go into more detail in this. Hold on. Here, I put it in the panelists and attendees. Okay, I've got other papers on this, but there's a little Q&A session I did with after a similar talk at UCL. I put it in the chat. You can have a look. Let me say this. The EU, as I said before, they do have tools. Now, it's true that, the EU, part of why it's in a trap is that, many tools, there's a lot of power for member governments within the EU, right? It's quite intergovernmental. And that means that a government like Hungary itself, or, with a few allied governments, they can be in the position to block a lot of things that in a more developed kind of true federation maybe could be done to single out states. So it is tougher in the EU. That being said, the EU does have tools, and that's why our topic today is so important. The key reason the EU didn't use the tools that it does have that might work is because Orban was politically protected by this powerful family. That divorce has happened, that protection is gone. So now there is the chance, infringement procedures where the EU sues member states for violating EU law and can follow up with penalty payment demands if they don't comply. The Commission has only brought a couple of those against Hungary and has brought them slowly, and only now for the first time, brought a case, I think, following up for non-compliance, asking for penalties, but they haven't been doing that. They could be dramatically more rigorous. They can suspend Hungary's money with this rule of law conditionality mechanism. They can do it if they want, right? I'm very confident that, the case would stand up if, when it's being challenged by Hungary, this whole regulation. So they can do these things. They can cut off his money. It's a question of whether they see it to be in their political interest to do so.
Okay, well, that is the $6 million question. So with that, I want to very much thank Dr. Kelemen for speaking with us today, and thank all of our participants. Again, please remember to fill out that survey as you're leaving. And for those who are interested, we will have a recording of this talk if there's something that you've missed or want to go back through, and that will be available on the CES website. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks to all the audience for coming.